So, welcome back to Night Flight. And today, Dr. Judd Burton is back, and we are going to talk about the collapse of the Bronze Age. A collapse that was so bad that, yeah, in that region, even the ability to read and write was lost for roughly 500 years. So, what happened there? And also, I have to say, when I looked into it, time and again, I had the thought, is it really that much different these days? But we will see. So, Dr. Burton, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, I have, before we jump into our subjects, I'm going to briefly share my screen because not everybody is an expert on the Bronze Age. So I thought it would be nice to have a visual aid. So here, of course, we have what we now know as Greece. Here is Troy. We have the Hittite Empire, the Assyrian Empire, and of course, Egypt. And all those people have been trading with each other. It was a very interconnected society. And what you can see here are those um, the red the red flames here. Yeah, they were sacked, those cities. And yeah, Babylon not. Babylon survived. Byblos not so much. And yeah, Egypt survived as well, but uh, yeah, it was a little bit, it lost some of its influence. And so, yeah, that is what we are talking about. The blue ones survived, yeah, yeah, not too many. And that had to do with the invasion of the sea peoples. And we will see who and what they were. So what time frame are we talking about here? I guess that collapse did not come overnight.
Right. Well, the sort of watermark date for that collapse is 1200 BC, the transition between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. But of course, there's an actual window of events that we're looking at in terms of the scope of the collapse of Bronze Age societies. Um, and really, you're looking at a span of about 200 years, really, on either side of that this is really kind of taking place. Um, but I think that although the Bronze Age collapse involves civilizations like the Mycenaean Empire and the Hittite Empire, the Assyrians, uh, the Egyptians, the entire, as you pointed out, the entire Eastern Mediterranean, economic nexus, if you will. I think it's important to kind of back up a little bit to talk
Okay.
about some tremors, you might say, some political, social, economic tremors. Um, that's an unintended pun there, but I usually start any discussion about this, or I used to tell my students that you can't really have a discussion about the Bronze Age collapse unless you back up a little bit and talk about the collapse of the Minoan Empire, which was predicated by the explosion of a volcano on the island of what is known
Santorini.
as Santorini now, but Thera in the ancient
Yeah.
world. And this happened about 1550 BC, and tremendous explosion, probably rivaling the Krakatoa explosion in Indonesia back in the late 19th century. It sent an ash cloud into the atmosphere that is very chartable. You can see it in the archaeological record all over the planet, really. Um, so it was a tremendous upheaval in the Eastern Mediterranean, even before the what scholars call the collapse of the Bronze Age. Um, and the reason that I think that this is an important predicate to a discussion about the Bronze Age collapse is because um, the demise or the decline of the Minoan Empire as a result of that left a power vacuum in the Aegean world. Um, and this is what led to the ascendancy of the Mycenaeans. And of course, there were Luvian kingdoms in Anatolia in Turkey, uh, and then there were the Hittites that were also interested, in becoming the um, the biggest benefactor, the controller of that economic sphere. And this inevitably led to a conflict, which was later mythologized by Homer in his epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. This great war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And for the longest time, uh, we thought that this war was a strictly a mythological epic, that it didn't have any grounding in history, until you had the likes of Frank Calvert and Heinrich Schliemann conducting excavations in the Aegean, and in particular Troy, and of course the successive decades of excavations that have gone on at Troy that have since demonstrated that Luvian city-state was an actual polity, and that the war between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Trojans actually did take place. And of course, there were the Hittites actually kept records on this, and they reference the name of the Mycenaean Confederacy, the Achaeans, Ilios, Priam, Agamemnon, all the big players show up in these Hittite records. And so we know that it wasn't just a rhapsody of Homer's just so that he could have content for his epic myth. Um, but this this war, the Trojan War, uh, also is an integral part of a discussion about the collapse of the Bronze Age, because um, it's really the fire that burns down the economic uh, essence of the Eastern Mediterranean, of the Aegean, and leads to all these epiphenomenal things that happen, like the invasions of the sea peoples and the general upheaval of not only the economy but the day-to-day lives of people in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the there's a lot to dig into uh, in terms of this conflict. But
So
the
was Troy, the destruction of Troy, a precursor to the collapse of the Bronze Age, or was it part of it?
I think that it's it's probably accurate to talk about it as a precursor, because the best we can figure is that it happens around 1250 BC and lasts for a number of years. So it's really sort of the most proximate catalyst, if you will, for the collapse of the Bronze Age. But it is strange because it also becomes this conduit whereby this new technology of ironsmithing makes its way into the Eastern Mediterranean via all of these, not just the activities of the sea peoples, but there are a number of migrations uh, that take place because of this. Again, adding to the magnitude of what happened when you throw. I think there was a volcano in Iceland that erupted in the 12th century that also had ramifications for the Eastern Mediterranean. there was a period of successive droughts that were predicated uh, uh, by this explosion. And so um, this upheaval and this movement, this strange set of circumstances, allows for the spread of this new technology, which scholars tell us um, ironsmithing probably makes its way from the Balkans um, via probably Romania. Sometime in the 13th century is where we can sort of trace that back to. Um, but it's one of those pivotal turning points for so many reasons in the trajectory of Western civilization. That any discussion bereft of it is an incomplete discussion when talking about Western civilization.
Mhm.
Uh, but there's some interesting things that, and I'll tease this a little bit. There's not just the material and documentary evidence uh, and the sort of day-to-day concerns like politics and economy that are interesting in this discussion, but there's a supernatural element to it as well, and this has to do with some of the records that the Egyptians kept about this period, and we could get into that as we go along today in our discussion.
Mhm. Okay. So the Minoans, who were they? The people of Crete?
Right, the Minoans were um, a civilization that flourished from about the middle of the third millennium BC until the aforementioned um, uh, explosion of the volcano Anthera in the 16th century BC. Um, they're an Indo-European uh, people as best as we can figure. Here within the last couple of years, we've learned more about them. Of course, um, we owe a debt of gratitude to the archaeology of Crete, um, beginning with people like Arthur Evans. Uh, but in terms of the language, it's been a real challenge because it didn't really behave like the other contemporary Greek language. The two Proto-Greek languages in the Aegean at the time, scholars have dubbed Linear A and Linear B. And Linear B was the Mycenaean version of that. Linear A was the Minoan. And it's not that we didn't have examples of their writing. We do, and we did, uh, but it was a language that didn't behave in a lot of ways like its sister language. Uh, Probably more accurate to say cousin language. But within the last couple of years, scholars have made some really good strides in Linear A. So much so that there was one of the headlines a couple of years ago was that they had cracked the Linear A code. Um, and so we're learning more about the Minoan civilization in addition to the material evidence, the documentary evidence they left behind. But they were the thriving economic um, power in the Aegean before the Bronze Age collapse, before the Macedonian Empire. And in a lot of ways, they're um, kind of the founders of what became Hellenistic or Greek culture. Um, a lot of scholars look to it as the birthplace of Greek mythology in a lot of ways. And it is some of the foundational myths in Greek mythology come from the island of Crete. Um, but the Minoans had a hegemony uh, in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly in the Aegean sphere. They were the ones that controlled the commerce there, and this survives to us not only in written records but also in the mythic memory of people. Some people may be familiar with the story of King Minos and a labyrinth. Well, Minos would exact a tribute from Athens on the mainland which was just a small village at the time in Mycenaean Greece. And there were to be 7 young men and 7 virgins that the Athenians would pay tribute to, so that and of course Minos would sacrifice them in the labyrinth to the Minotaur to keep the Minotaur at bay. And so this myth kind of it puts a literary gloss over the hegemony that the Minoans actually had over the Aegean world at the time. But they were the powerhouse to begin with, before their civilization declined. And if people do a Google search, or they watch documentaries or anything like that, people will undoubtedly recognize the palace, the remnants of the palace at Knossos. That's probably the most famous, um, the famous site, restored site on Crete, with the brilliant red columns and the bright blues and purples that were used. Very iconic imagery. Um, but uh, the Minoans are the apt predicate to any discussion of this, because um, in a lot of ways the Minoans are the linchpin, and the creators of the economy in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly the less so the southern portion, but certainly the Aegean sphere.
Hmm. Yeah, what I find interesting about the Minoans, from what they have unearthed, there are 3 colors that you will see time and again. That is white, red, and black.
Hmm.
And interestingly enough, those are also the colors of Atlantis.
Yes, they're also the colors of my alma mater. Um, One of the things that I always found interesting about the Minoans is their version of the bullfight that's
Hmm.
that's depicted in their iconography, which I always thought was really interesting. Um, and I was and still am a huge fan of Frank Herbert's Dune novels, and the Atreides family is actually connected to this group. I'm sort of veering off course a little bit here. But the main character, Paul Atreides, his grandfather is killed in a bullfight, and so there are these little nuggets of of these Minoan and Mycenaean traditions that exist peppered throughout Frank Herbert's, especially his first novel. I don't think that's by accident, because he was a pretty sharp guy himself. But yeah, the we're still learning about the Minoans, like I say, and it's an exciting time because of the linguistic um, advances that we're making right now on linear A.
Yeah. So it appears to me that the collapse was brought on not only by one event. You mentioned 2 volcanoes that erupted, and I would assume that brought the problem of droughts or maybe a bad harvest with
Mm-hmm.
it. And then came the invasion of the sea peoples. So
Mm.
was that a multiple cataclysm?
Well, I think the latter volcano, the Icelandic explosion, is the more proximate one, um, of concern, in the context of the late Bronze Age collapse. Um, Certainly, this did impact the agriculture and the pastoralism in the Eastern Mediterranean, because we do have evidence of it, like I say, extended drought. Um, but this upheaval with the shakeup in the Aegean after the Trojan War, and the climactic upheaval that took place, um, because it basically upended the economy. Think about what happens in a like with the tsunami that hit Southeast Asia,
Mhm.
a number of years ago. Um, people's homes were destroyed, their livelihoods were, decimated. People had to move to other places, and that's certainly something that's taking place in the context of the late Bronze Age collapse. Is you've got people migrating, they're moving because their lives have been destroyed, their property has been destroyed, their livelihood has been destroyed, and so people are you've got more people than you usually would have over a widespread area, desperate, looking to put food on the table for their families, looking to survive themselves. And so these conditions are, they foster what we actually see unfolding in this period in the Bronze Age collapse. The Dorian migration is one of them. The amalgamation of this confederacy of basically what amount to pirates, the sea peoples, that
Mm.
are they're kind of they're a mixed bag. Very much like pirates in our own day, or at any period in history. They're a mixed group of people from different backgrounds, from different ethnicities. They've banded together for common interest, common economic interest. Um, because one of the ways that people made money, particularly in the Bronze Age, if you were a coastal power of any sort, was to raid your neighbor. Uh, if you can't generate the wealth, then steal it. And so this is certainly a mechanism of economic modality that is expanded during the course of the Bronze Age, because people like this group, the Sea Peoples, uh, they're they're looking to make money any way they can, and they revert to the technique of coastal raiding. And there are areas of the Eastern Mediterranean that are hit harder than others by this. The entire Eastern Mediterranean rim suffered, um, suffered the depredations of the Sea Peoples. But it seems like, and it really shouldn't surprise us a great deal, but it seems like that the Egyptians really caught hell when it came to the invasions of the Sea Peoples. And that makes sense because they were they were the one of the most wealthy polities in the Eastern Mediterranean, and so um, and the coastal settlements there were prime pickings for a group of pirates like the Sea Peoples. Um, but
I
the
was.
Sea Peoples are actually a group of people that we're also becoming more familiar with linguistically, as we're able to crack some of these languages that we hadn't been able to before. There are a number of Anatolian languages, for instance, that have proven challenging, to say the least, that are beginning to divulge more and more about this mixed group of people, the Sea Peoples.
Hmm. So if you say that was, yeah, a standard practice to raid the coast of another country, was there a time during the Bronze Age when it was somewhat peaceful between all those, um, let's say, city states or whatever? Because they also traded. So,
Right. That's right. Yeah. And that sort of commerce was better for everybody, and all the polities involved knew that. And so there were trade agreements that kept, raiding parties and things like that to a bare minimum. But let's say in the heyday of, the Mycenaean kingdom, um, that was one of the things that you did, is you raided other city states. Um, but yeah, there, and one of the best pieces of evidence I think that illustrates that there was a kind of peaceful commercial existence, relatively speaking, for the Bronze Age anyway, is this there's a period of what scholars call Orientalizing. There are actually two major periods of Orientalizing between the Aegean world and the Levantine world. So the Mycenaeans were trading with people in the Levant, in places like Phoenicia, um, and so we know that agreement existed. In other words, it's not it's certainly implicit in the archaeological evidence because there are Mycenaean shaft burials in northern Israel, in what would have been ancient Phoenicia. Uh, the art of both periods of Orientalizing and Greek art shows influence from the ancient Near East. So you end up getting things like um, sphinxes and cherubs and things like that on Greek pottery, particularly in the second phase. But the first phase of Orientalizing is what's important to our discussion today, because as I say, it illustrates this commercial tranquility that had to exist, that had to be protected um, to a degree for there to be such a bloom of economic prosperity. But as history illustrates, it took it took a series of circumstances to unfold that completely undid that and turned people desperate. Uh, that led to you know the the collapse of most of the major kingdoms and empires in the Eastern Mediterranean, with the exception of um, the new kingdom in Egypt and the rising power in the Mesopotamian world, the Assyrians. It was a complete, reshaping, reshuffling of cultures and powers.
Mhm. I recently had an interview with Ralph Ellis,
Hmm.
and he briefly mentioned the collapse of the Bronze Age because we've been talking about Egypt, and he said, in a way, it is as if the little islands in the Caribbean suddenly are attacking the United States. Would you
Hmm.
agree? Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like that, um, particularly in the case of the Sea Peoples. Um, you know, some of these people were Aegean Islanders. There were the people from all the little islands in the Aegean, and even some of the bigger ones like Crete. The Egyptians talk about the Pelesht. Um, the, these are the Philistines of the Bible. They were from Crete originally. So yeah, it's like you've got these pockets of these displaced peoples from disparate parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, and they come together and cause tremendous upheaval for the coastal communities and kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Hmm. So if those peoples, if they traded with each other, I assume they were also interconnected,
Hmm.
like we are
Right,
today,
right.
even more so. And was there, for instance, an interdependency for raw metal?
Yes, because you couldn't. There were uh, just as like today, there are certain commodities that you can get in certain places of the world that aren't available in others.
Mhm.
Um, because it's the Bronze Age, of course, copper is going to be a marketable, highly marketable, highly sought after commodity. Um, and there were different places. One of the places that you get them, and it's preserved in the name, is the island of Cyprus. Everybody wanted a piece of Cyprus because of the copper deposits there. And that's what made that's another thing that sort of kept the peace, is because, at least for a time, because the Cypriots did have something that a lot of people in the Eastern Mediterranean needed, because the metal technology was bronze, and you needed bronze and tin,
Mm.
which was another commodity that was not exactly easy to get a hold of. Yet the Phoenicians were famous for trading for tin and disparate parts around the Mediterranean basin, even as far as the British Isles. Uh, so um, there is a huge interdependency, uh, but not just for fundamental things like copper, but um, for
Right.
timber, for grain from the Pontus, from I mean, there's a laundry list of things, and so yeah, there is an interconnectedness and an interdependency in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Mm. So the sea peoples are probably more, yeah, let's say a symptom of the collapse than the real cause. Would, yeah.
Yes, I would say so. They're epiphenomenal. That's the word that I would say. They're a kind of spasm, if you will, of the last portion of the collapse of the Bronze Age. Um, an important one, um, because it's such a violent uh, mechanism that the coastal regions in the Eastern Mediterranean have to deal with. Um, we know, again, like I said, we know most of what we know about the Sea Peoples largely from uh, records that the Egyptians kept, um, the Merneptah records in particular, and the Kadesh inscriptions. Again, as another consequence of vying for power in the wake of the collapse. Um, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptians uh, go to war against one another, and one of the pivotal battles is the Battle of Kadesh, which takes place in the Levant around 1200 BC. And the this is probably the largest, if not one of the largest, battles in ancient Western tradition. It's certainly one of the most attested and recorded battles. There were probably somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 charioteers, uh, just droves and droves of military personnel and material that are put to use in this thing. Um, Consequently, if people want a visual for this, if you watch Ridley Scott's Exodus movie, the big battle at the beginning of that movie is the Battle of Kadesh. So that's the battle in question here. Um, and again, there are not only list of the captives that they take from the Sea Peoples, of where they're from, whether they're from Anatolia or parts of Anatolia like Phrygia, or they're Luvian, or they're Heleshed, or whoever they are. We've got a pretty good accounting of where they're from. Not only in terms of the naming, the recounting of the names of these ethnicities, but also we've got good visual depictions of, in other words, their hairstyles and kind of clothing, the weaponry they were using, that sort of thing. So thanks to the Egyptians, we get a pretty good pictorial and documentary accounting for the invasions and depredations of the sea peoples. And I think one of the most interesting things about the Kadesh inscription is that um, one of the panels depicts these captives from the Levant that the Egyptians take, that they called the Shasu, and the Shasu were also called the Anek, which is interesting because that sounds a lot like the Anakim, the sons of Anak in the Levant, who are depicted as being gigantic in the biblical text, such as in the passage in Numbers. Um, but what's really interesting is the depiction of these captives. There are two captives, and they're on their knees, and they're being beaten by the Egyptians. They're depicted as being Shazu's spies. But it's very clear that although these two individuals are kneeling, they're about twice as tall as the people that are beating them,
Hmm.
which is interesting in and of itself because typically the Egyptians didn't depict their enemies as larger than themselves. Usually it was the other way around. And so the whole what art historians call the hierarchy of scale, when Egypt, not just the Egyptians, but a lot of ancient peoples did this where they depicted themselves as larger than their enemies. This panel in the Kadesh inscription sort of blows the hierarchy of scale notion out of the water because the Egyptians are not depicting their enemies uh, as smaller than them. In fact, they're twice as tall. And so I think this is probably one of the best ancient pictorial depictions of the giants that were said to have lived in the Levant. Um, and that's that little supernatural nugget that I was talking about at the beginning of the discussion, because amidst all of this, and all of the records that we have about the Bronze Age collapse, it's a very important thing in and of itself. But interspersed in between, hidden in all of that, is this depiction of these Anakim, uh, Shasu from the Levant, that the Egyptians had taken captive. So I think it's an interesting kind of footnote, if you will, to the events that comprise the Bronze Age collapse.
Yeah. So, do you have any idea what happened to the Anakim after that?
I
Because, yeah,
No, go ahead.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because, I can imagine, let's say famine because of bad harvest, drought, or what have you, is an issue in large areas of the world. So
Mhm.
I would imagine that feeding a giant race is even more complicated
Mhm.
uh, than, your 160 Egyptian. Yeah, I'm talking about meters here.
Mhm.
So, do you have any idea what happened to them?
Yes, I've got a hypothesis about that.
Mm.
Um, One of the things that you have to factor into, um, and these are events that lead into the Bronze Age collapse. But technically, this is the period of the judges. I think that some scholars will date the Hebrew conquest of Canaan around this time. I personally think that it's earlier, probably at least a couple centuries earlier. But what's clear, whatever the timetable, what's clear in the biblical narrative is that there were these giant tribes that the Hebrews were still routing out of Canaan. Um, I think that there is a diaspora of sorts. Though, in other words, the ones that are not killed off in the conquest of Canaan simply go to other places, and the Mediterranean is a natural east-west corridor. And so I think that they went to other places in the world. I think that they went to Germanic regions. I think that they went to the Celtic regions in Western Europe. Um, I think that they ended up in places like the Americas. Um, this it's interesting that this Bronze Age collapse and the end of the conquest period in Canaan really kind of dovetails with the emergence of civilization in the New World. In other words, um, the the Olmec and then the Maya in Mesoamerica began living in city states and building city states and monumental architecture around this time. And there are a number of Mayan and Olmec rulers that were said to have been gigantic. And so I think that there are different places around the planet that they went to. They simply went to other places that were still developing socially so that they could manipulate the development of those particular societies, which is something that has historically been attached to what the various giant tribes had done throughout history anyway, as kind of civilization, uh, if not civilization builders, then cultural engineers of cultural engineers of one sort or another. Um, so I think that there's a diaspora in many directions. I think that they went the other way too. I just think that the Western trajectory through the Mediterranean was a natural and easy, relatively easy way for them to find other homes, essentially.
Hmm. So, if the arrival of the marauders, the sea peoples, was, yeah, so to say, the cherry on the cake, the last gasp of the collapse, what did the early stages of that collapse look like, and what brought it on?
Again, I think the really the early stage is the period of the Trojan War. You know,
Okay.
that's this period of vying for hegemony in the Aegean. Everybody wanted a piece of um, that very lucrative commerce that came out of the Aegean. So uh, that's that's really the initial in my mind that conflict that went on for a number of years and led to the demise ultimately of the Mycenaeans and some of these Luwian states, because it's what follows is scholars have called the Greek Dark Ages. This period that lasts from about 1100 to about 800 BC. Um, it, it's not that the Mycenaeans or their culture just disappeared off the planet. There's a lot of Mycenaean culture that survives in the course of the Greek Dark Ages, but the hegemony that they had enjoyed in centuries past was gone, um, and this was it's almost like dropping a pebble, in a stone. This is like the first element when you throw in all these other things like the volcano in Iceland and the periods of successive droughts and people being displaced and moving around. It's a multi-level, it's a multifaceted uh, series of events. But I think that the initial stages are this conflict between Alluvian city-state Troy and the Mycenaean Confederacy across the Aegean.
Mhm. Would you say that in this particular case, uh, the interconnectedness was not beneficial to them?
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? It it made these kingdoms stable and wealthy for a time, but it also sort of provided the infrastructure for their demise, if you will,
Mm.
because a system that's that interconnected, um, when you destroy one part of it, there are going to be repercussions in other parts of it. That's probably the best way to describe it, is that it was both this mechanism for prosperity, and a period of relative economic peace. But because these places were so interconnected by trade, um, a major blow to one corner of it had massive destructive ramifications for the rest of it.
Yeah, that, let's say, for some stupid reason, the United States would collapse. Yeah.
Yep.
And of course, that has ramifications for other countries as well.
Well, I mean, not just the United States, but I mean,
Mm.
if Japan,
Yeah.
let's say that the tsunami back in 2011 had completely decimated Japan. That's the kind of thing that heralds a worldwide economic depression.
Mm.
So yeah, in today's world, we're 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 even more interconnected commercially, technologically, socially, politically, than they were in the Eastern Mediterranean. So you can imagine the kind of, if there's a dramatic upheaval in some corner of this system, then it's going to affect other parts. Um, so yeah, it's the same kind of logic at play here. So we still we still do that very precipitous dance today. We enjoy the fact that we can get coffee from South America, or any number of commodities from any, pick whatever you want from another part of the world and get it to us. We enjoy that. We enjoy the interconnectedness of the internet. We're able to have discussions like this. Um, but the the other side of that coin is that those structures, that interconnectedness, is susceptible to tremendous disruption. Just in the case of the internet, think about how important internet security has become just in the past 10 years,
Mhm.
and how dependent nation states are on the internet, and how cautious and dare I say fearful nation states are of their internet computerized infrastructures being hacked, and that does happen. And it, if a hack of substance, let's say, occurs, then that can have tremendous ramifications for not just that nation state, but for the nation states that it does trade with, that it has diplomatic relations with. And so we still have analogous concerns today to those that existed in the world of the Eastern Mediterranean during the collapse of the Bronze Age.
Mhm.
And that's why it's important to remember and study history. Is what can we learn from the collapse of the Bronze Age that might benefit us here in the 21st century.
Yeah. So, you know, that it reminds me a little bit. A lot of people here, of course, have solar panels on their houses.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them think they are safe because of that in case the grid goes down.
Mm-hmm.
But that is actually not true because, yes, they can be on the safe side if they're if they have the possibility to run it, yeah, like a little island, yeah, if they can disconnect from the rest of the grid. But usually, or the majority, they are all connected to the grid as well, which means if they do not have the technology to run it without the grid, then their electricity is down as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
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 So that means we should have, yeah, some precautions for how to function if this and that. And it's always better to have those thoughts and those plans before something happens, because
Right.
then it's too late. And once people start panicking, that's always a bad advisor.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I don't really see that these days. Do you?
What the
Yeah, that there are, let's say, attempts to make it possible that if one collapses, that not
oh
everything. Yeah,
yeah,
I don't
no,
see.
no, it no, it's not. Um, and that's a danger. Um, I think that more and more people are having to come to terms with, particularly now. Um, here in the states, um, one of the things that some people push is, build networks with farmers and ranchers and local businesses, and that way you've got a network, that's local, where you're getting your thing, instead of depending on a middleman and some big corporation to provide you know your everyday needs, essentially. um, I think that mindset is becoming, not appealing is probably not the right word, but it's more a matter of practicality, pragmatism, so that communities are not so impacted, in case one part of, in case those big corporations stop delivering, in case the trucking system, is not, the shipping system is not working, um,
Yeah,
which we've, basically every corner of the world has experienced that in the last 3 years. You know, not just on the shipping end, but on the production end as well.
yeah,
So I think as a matter of course, as a matter of pragmatism, people are um, having to consider that more and more these days.
yeah. But yeah, I agree. But these are, yeah, private initiatives, yeah,
Hmm.
from
Hmm.
citizens themselves.
Hmm.
But what I meant is those that are actually paid for it to think
Well,
and to think
well,
ahead.
right.
There's none
Yeah.
use as always. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah. It would be great if the the people that we elected and put into power, if they would do the job that they're paid to do. And I'm not saying that all of them are like that, but a lot of them don't don't do that. You know, And in a perfect world, that would be great. You know, if we could create that utopia, that would be great. But um, you know, more and more people are just, you know, like you say, on the citizen level, are just having to take matters into their own hands,
Yeah.
um, for the good of their own families and themselves and their community. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that you know, somebody's got to take care of you. Got to take care of you. And if you don't do it, then you can't really depend on elected officials to do that all the time,
Mm.
to sort of micromanage our worlds. Um, but you know, again, these are in a modern gloss. These the same kinds of issues that concerned people uh, in the late Bronze Age, and they, you know, these kingdoms and unfortunately the people that lived in them paid a hefty toll for the breakdowns in that infrastructure.
Yeah. You already mentioned the Greek Dark Ages, and
Hmm.
then we had Dark Ages a little bit further ahead again.
Hmm.
And when I put that together, oh, that makes my skin crawl. What we lost in
Hmm.
terms of knowledge, in terms of development. My goodness, how significant was that?
Well, in the case of the Greek Dark Age, it has some pretty important cultural ramifications for Greece. Um, but we certainly we lose direct contact with those older proto-Greek worlds, like the particularly the Minoans, probably less so the Mycenaeans, but especially the Minoans. Um, but there's, you know, basically the city states in Greece become more insular because of that. Um, and but like I say, there are some important things that come out of the Greek Dark Age in terms of Greek culture and even intellectualism, just as the European Dark Ages kind of do the same thing for Europe. But the bardic tradition that existed in the Greek Dark Age basically concretized Greek mythology and the rudiments of Greek religion as it would be observed in the Archaic and the Classical periods. Um, the it it reinvested a kind of hunger amongst the Greek city states to start trading and exploring again, and that's the big colonizing period in Greek history as a result of the Greek Dark Age, when the Greeks established colonies all over the Mediterranean basin as far away as Spain.
Hmm.
So it's it's a period of literary stagnation in a lot of ways, um, and it's difficult to quantify. You know, to one degree or another, there are sort of micro dark ages that take place in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's just that the Greek Dark Ages is protracted one. And yeah, there's always going to be this literary stagnation. I mean, intellectualism of a kind is going to survive in pockets, just like it did in the European Dark Ages. You know, the you've got the Irish monks, you know, who preserve a lot of Latin and Greek learning. You've got Charlemagne and his palace schools. You know, Alcuin of York. You know, was really the genius behind that. And so you do have these pockets of learning and intellectualism that are preserved, but as far as the culture is concerned, it's a period of stagnation, and
Yeah.
that's why we call it a dark age. Is
Yeah.
for that very reason.
Yeah.
But it's hard to quantify what knowledge we lost because of that. Um,
The European Dark Ages lasted for how long? A couple of hundred
The
years.
European
Yeah,
Dark Ages last from the fall of the Western Empire
yeah.
from 476 um, until the end of the 11th century.
Oh my goodness.
Hmm.
Yeah, you know why? If I count these two events together in terms of loss of knowledge,
Hmm.
we could be 1,000 years ahead.
We could be, um, you know, the you know the loss of the Library of Alexandria
Mm.
is probably a huge part of that in terms of what we would know and where we could be. Um,
I'm
I
not so
suspect
sure if not a huge chunk would be found in the Vatican.
that's entirely possible. Um, I remember hearing a story about this was years ago on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell,
Mm,
and the fellow he was interviewing had written a book on so-called secrets of the Vatican archives, and one of the chapters was on a priest by the name of Peregrinato,
mm.
and he was a physicist. And according to this fellow, he had designed a time machine that the Vatican had used to go back and film significant biblical events like the Exodus and the crucifixion of Jesus and any number of hallmark events in the biblical narrative.
They,
Nothing
they,
that would not surprise me.
yeah, they made a TV series about that.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember it was only one season, so a mini series, you could say. But yeah, there was a scientist, and he couldn't get over the loss of his daughter. So he invented with his team something where you can go back in time and see it like a movie. And
Okay.
that way he wanted to stay connected. And one of the first things that they saw was the crucifixion scene.
Hmm. Interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, what you just said that reminded me of this. I forgot the name. I don't know. Okay, anyhow, is it thinkable that okay, we have famine, we have the sea people, we have yeah, the volcanoes. Is it thinkable that on top of it there was also internal fighting, meaning the the people against the elites, that there was internal rebellion during that time, that people just simply had enough uh, being poor, 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 and the rest were living, the good life. So, is that possible that that was also the case?
Yes, and I think that the very emergence of a group like the Sea Peoples is somewhat evidence of that.
Hmm.
That there had been people who had involved in trying to change the status quo, as it were, but were unable to do so, and so they turned to piracy as a means of income, not just income but survivability.
Mm, yeah. And the Egyptians, did they have ever problems with their own people?
Well,
Or were
yes, I mean that there were several interregnums that result because of that during the course of Egyptian history. Um, and you know, sometimes, well, as in the case of Akhenaten, Akhenaten, speaking of the New Kingdom, Akhenaten comes in uh, with this new revelation, about how Egyptian religion is supposed to be, and it turns into this. He turns it into the worship of the Aton, the sun disk, a kind of henotheism or monotheism, and moves the capital farther south. It's he he shuts off a lot of diplomatic and economic contact, which undoubtedly did have ramifications. So much so that the people, via the priesthood, who were not really happy about what Akhenaten had done in terms of Egyptian religion, just sort of peripheralizing the old gods that they had worshipped for millennia. Um, that uh, his family came under scrutiny, and he's eventually exiled because of it. So there are examples of this taking place in the context of this demise of interconnectivity during the late Bronze.
Mm. Yeah, Ralph Ellis said that this Amana, yeah, he had his palace, yeah, okay, but the rest around it was really poorly done. It
Oh
had, yeah.
yeah, it's
So,
it's a almost a Marie Antoinette sort of scenario. The let them eat the Egyptian equivalent of cake is was basically his philosophy.
mhm, yeah. Although more and more people are saying that Marie Antoinette never said
Well, if she didn't say it, she certainly she certainly
she
modeled it.
implied it. Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Sometimes you just don't have to phrase it. That's
Hmm.
all.
That's right.
So why do you think Egypt, yeah, came out a little bit better than the rest of the?
Well, there are a number of reasons for this, probably. Um, the fact that uh, Egypt was long established, um, even before a number of, well, virtually all of the kingdoms that existed in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. Egypt is already, 2,000 years old by this time. So they've got the establishment there. Um, for all of their faults, they did have uh, a sound military. Um, Plus, Egypt, uh, people have to remember that the Nile Valley was one of the bread baskets in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Pontus on the coast of the Black Sea was the other big one, but um, the Nile Valley was a huge breadbasket. Uh, People got grain there from other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. So because that was such a staple commodity, I suspect that, well, I don't suspect, I know it's evinced in the very recovery of the New Kingdom, that was one of the bases for their bouncing back as quickly as they did. And you can't say that for um, you know Mycenaean Greece, which Greece is there are fertile parts of it certainly, but it's craggy and rocky, and um, there Egypt was just in a position politically, socially, militarily, economically to bounce back in a way that other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean were not.
Yeah. And who do you think, let's speculate a little bit. Let's say such an event, it started with a volcano, and then, yeah, push came to shove. Who do you think would come out of it on top these days?
Hmm. That's a hard question to answer. Let's say that a volcano, um,
Mhm,
somewhere on the magnitude of Santorini
mhm,
occurred, and we went through a nuclear winter, which was probably what the first year was like. And in the succeeding year, we've got unreliable crops. Um, it's going to be the countries that have the best natural resources, that have the best agriculture systems, I think, that are in place, and certainly the ones that have the best stores of of supplies and food and things like that that are gonna come out on top. I think that most of the countries in the first world would be able to, not without, again, not without, casualties, but I think that most of the first world nations would be able to survive something like that. It would be the developing nations, the second world nations, and the third world nations that would be hit the hardest.
mhm. But funny enough, especially in the so-called first world nations, we see an attack on agriculture. Um, the fields have
Yes.
to be smaller. The amount of fertilizer that you can use is limited, and this is limited. So another stupid decision.
Yeah. I, in fact, I posted something a couple of weeks ago about the um, the World Economic Forum.
Mhm.
Uh, First, they went after carbon. Now they're going after nitrogen. Now there are only two other elements they have to go after to eradicate organic life. I sort of said that tongue in cheek, but you know, you're right. I mean, now, granted, I understand regulating nitrogen fertilizer. I get that to a point, but you can't grow you can't grow crops without nitrogen. You can't do it. Whatever your fertilizer is, whether it's you know manure or industrial fertilizer or whatever. It doesn't matter. You're going to need that. And the sort of the hypocrisy of those kinds of regulations are that these corporate agricultural outfits buy up huge tracts of land. They gobble up land, and they're able to get away with whatever they want to, essentially, whether it's not just with crops, but with like, gosh, here in the States, you know, the conditions in feedlots where they raise cattle and chickens and things like that, they're cramped and they're in their own filth, and it's not like raising free range herd animals, whatever they happen to be. And so there's this complete double standard that exists, in the bodies and uh, groups that are regulating and mandating these sorts of things, and they're becoming increasingly more constrictive. Um, so on the one hand, we haven't been. I get it. We could always be better stewards of the planet, but on the other hand, the means by which these constrictions are coming down, and tying it all in with climate change, so-called climate change, is it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There's a huge double standard there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. That's a danger, is that now in first world nations, uh, they want to hedge out. They want to make it more difficult for people to, not just have a farm or a ranch or something like that, but a garden, to grow
Yeah.
your own food.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say we are on a good way to another collapse. Unfortunately, I have to notice that.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think, I think the only, well, and hi, historians do one of the best things I think they do is in the field of futuristics, being able to, you know, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation if it weren't for analogous studies like the collapse of the Bronze Age, you know. Um, but then you have historians like uh, Noah Harari,
Mhm.
uh, that Klaus Schwab seems to be so enamored with right now, uh, whose predictions about the future and suggestions about the trajectory of where we should be going, to his solution, in other words, for avoiding this collapse, is this transhuman evolution into something that's not human, and that um, the only way that we could possibly, withstand the change that's coming is to download our brains into a computer and continue our existence like that. Um,
Yeah, but consciousness is not made in the brain.
exactly, exactly,
So what
exactly.
are they going to download there?
Well, that's a great question, but for people like Harari, they've taken consciousness and supernaturalism out of the equation, uh, going so far as to say that we are the gods. We're the gods that can create the next. Um, it's amazing. Harari is an interesting guy to me, not because I subscribe to what he says by any stretch of the imagination, but he claims to be a huge fan, a huge. He claims to be influenced hugely by Jared Diamond, and Jared Diamond is famous for writing, most famous for Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is this really interesting world history. Um, you may have read it. Some of your listeners may have read it. Um, but it assesses things like the rise and fall of civilizations along these lines, like we're talking about today with the Bronze Age collapse. Um, and whereas Diamond has a kind of optimism, or at least a realistic optimism, a hope, if you will, that we have the capability, uh, within ourselves, to, if not avoid the collapse, then survive it and make something better on the other side. Um, Harari uh, seems to take this
Further.
strange, uh, almost inhuman
Mhm.
future for the rest of us, and it's an odd thing to me, because I myself am influenced by Diamond's work, but in a much different, sharply different manner. Um, I met Diamond once at a conference, and I found him to be just that. He immediately talked about wanted to talk about the local history and the all of these layers of causation and effect. And I found him not only from his writings, but also as a person and a scholar. I found him very hopeful, and I don't get that
No,
from.
absolutely not. No,
uh,
no. What I get from him is darkness, nothing else.
Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah. And I don't think it's a good idea to follow those uh, men with dark.
no, no, no. I think the WEF and other groups like them have given us enough reason for a rational human being not to listen to them or follow them. But
Yeah,
that's the key there, right, Judith?
yeah,
Ration
exactly.
reason and rationality.
Yeah, that is out of the window somehow for a lot of people. You have this huge chunk that is following and supporting always the current thing.
Mhm.
Um, then you have an even bigger chunk that is highly apathetic. And then you have a very small portion who get it, where this is heading. And yeah, we will see. We will see how that turns out. So, is there anything that you would like to mention about the collapse of the Bronze Age that we haven't touched on that is important to understand?
I think that I've hit on most of the points that I wanted to tease out about the collapse. Only to say that again, for the portion of our discussion that's dealt with the modern world, that's why it's important to study things like the collapse of the Bronze Age, is
Yeah,
because we find these patterns and similarities with our own world. They were interconnected. We were interconnected in ways that they probably couldn't even dream about. And so but because we're so much more interconnected, um, the possibility for greater calamity exists. And so, if people want to read or learn more about the Bronze Age collapse, there's certainly no shortage of work that's been done. If you want some more scholarly sources, I would point you to um, uh, scholars like Eric Klein, who
Eric
has written.
what?
Eric Klein,
Klein.
Cline. He's written a number of papers and I think a couple of books on the Bronze Age collapse.
Yeah, I also found that there are multiple documentaries on YouTube about the collapse
Hmm.
of the
Right.
age. Yeah. And there was one documentary, but it's not on YouTube. I found it on a streaming platform. But you know, towards the end, I really had to shut it off. They talked about something I never heard that word before. Something with earthquakes, that there was a, oh, I even forgot the word. Well, in other words, one earthquake after the other, and that
Hmm.
somehow also um, added to the whole conundrum.
Sure.
And then towards the end, they made the comparison with our days, and then yeah, but at least we are doing something against climate change. And that was the point where I had to switch.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Because I can imagine what the rest of it is. So, and yeah,
yeah. Well, yeah. If The problem with climate, so-called climate change science or climate science, is that they're basing a lot of of their conjecture that they like to pass off as law
Mm,
on 200 or 300 years worth of weather records. That's about as long as we've been able to consistently record weather patterns.
yeah.
The only way to look at weather before that is geologically, uh,
And weather
and
is not climate.
it's it's not climate. And I hear the word climate change, I'm thinking as an archaeologist and anthropologist, I'm thinking that's all our climate has done is
Yeah,
change. That's
exactly.
all it does is change. And so that's not even an accurate depiction of what you're trying to push as science. And there were
Ice
times.
ages.
Yeah,
We have,
exactly.
yeah,
And there were times in our primeval past when there's so much volcanic activity that you could hardly breathe the atmosphere. You know, um, that is something that is completely alien and distant to the last 200 or 300 years of weather record. And so it to me, it just seems absurd. It's something that you could solve by reading a geology book or an oceanography textbook, but here it is. It's science by consensus and not by
yeah,
not
yeah,
by reproduction.
yeah. As long as the paycheck comes.
Yeah.
So, okay, thank you so much for coming. And I've been looking forward to this conversation. It
Yes,
took
and
us.
if I'm sorry, Judith. I meant to say, if people
Yeah.
are interested, um, I teach a program on Mediterranean civilization,
Yeah.
and we do cover the collapse of the Bronze Age.
Hmm.
And people can email me at professorburton@yahoo.com, or they can go to burtonbeyond.net/IBA, and there'll be some information about it there.
Okay. Yeah, great. So, whoever is interested can take the class. And when would it start?
It's a revolving. I designed this program so that people can access the material whenever they want to.
Hmm?
So
Ah,
it's
okay.
just it's on your own schedule, and
Hmm.
we do a group chat every month.
Yeah. Okay. So, wonderful. That was it. Night flight for today with the wonderful Judd Burton. And we see you all next time. Until then, stay safe. Bye bye.